Okay, test. It's working. Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca DeSchoinitz, an Associate Professor of History at BYU, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the History Department's inaugural Book of the Year discussion. This year's book, on Juneteenth, by award-winning historian Annette Gordon-Reed, centers on issues of race, equity, belonging, history, and memory, is no accident. It is one way we are answering President Worthen's call to action at BYU. This initiative is in direct response to his call to better come together to address injustice and to truly love one another, to lead out in rooting out the sin of racism. History as a discipline is uniquely positioned to lead out on this important work. The university's report on race, equity, and belonging, released in February, includes a poignant remark along these lines from Harvard Divinity School professor David Holland, who's a BYU history alumnus and Elder Holland's son. He explains, "I have come to see my academic work as a historian as sacred. It enables and even forces me to understand the historic pains that those around me carry. As William Faulkner wrote of the pain of history, the past is never dead. It's not even past. We live with the consequences of history, and many of those consequences come in the form of open sores." David Holland says, "We dismiss them at our peril, and we must handle them the way God taught us in the Restoration, with robust communication, with a prioritized concern for empathy, and with a dogged determination to be present with each other." He continues, "There is much, much to celebrate and value from the past, but like a sorrowing soul that carries the wounds of youth, wounds that sometimes make even the most basic of relationships nearly impossible now, so our world is full of communities that carry such pain. If we are to work to heal this world, which is what I understand to be the disciples' task, we need to be serious about understanding and addressing its wounds. God himself, the God of the Restoration, set our example for such a thing." Many of you who are here today have read the book, and we look forward to a conversation that's centered on your questions and comments. But for those who haven't, I'll just quickly explain that this book begins with the author, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning African-American historian of early American history, who grew up in East Texas, whose family roots in Texas stretch back to the 1820s, and who was herself the Ruby Bridges of her hometown. So she was the first to integrate an all-white elementary school in Conroe, Texas. She's reflecting on the growing national attention to Juneteenth, which is a day long celebrated in Texas as the day that enslaved African Americans were told that slavery had ended. June 19th, 1865. And yes, that's 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and a little more than 2 months after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And from there, she really helps us to understand the significance of that day. And she does this by exploring the longer history of Texas as it's interwoven with her own family history and her own experiences and her own memories growing up. And she looks at how and why that longer history shaped what came after. And she explains the importance of doing this by referencing the William Faulkner quote that Holland shared in a talk that he gave at BYU. But she suggests, I think, a compelling revision of that quote. She says, "The past is dead, but like other formerly living things, echoes of the past remain, leaving their traces in the people and the events of the present and future." So, I'm excited for us to engage with this book and hope that we'll think about it and our study of history in the context of the university's larger commitment to rise up and build the beloved community. Our panelists today are Dr. Christopher Jones, who's an assistant professor of history at BYU. He teaches courses on early American history, slavery and the slave trade, and family history. He grew up in Plano, Texas. Dr. Jenny Pulsiver teaches early Native American and Native American history here at BYU. Her books include Subjects Unto the Same King, Indians, English, and the Contest for Authority in Colonial New England, and Swindler Sachem, the American Indian who sold his birthright, dropped out of Harvard, and conned the King of England. Her current project is a biography of her own Shoshone ancestors. Cole Stewart Johnson, and these folks are all in order here of their opening remarks, is from Arlington, Texas. He is studying accounting and graduates in April. After graduation, he will work for Deloitte in their risk and financial advisory practice located in Boston, where he hopes to mentor and become active in the community. He is married and has a son who just turned 2, who's joining us in the back of the room. Angelica Mathis is a native Texan and a senior in the history program. And finally, Dr. Matt Mason is a professor of history at BYU who writes and teaches about slavery, antebellum politics, and the Civil War era. The way that we'll kind of proceed today is each of these folks will share some opening comments, and then we'll then kind of respond to each other's comments a little bit, and then we'll open it up to audience question and answers. And if you can come down and line up to use this microphone there, that would be great. As is the custom at BYU, we'll open with a prayer, and that will be offered by Makoto Hunter. Makoto is a history major from Tempe, Arizona. She's graduated in April and has been involved with a really great initiative also that the history department is doing called the BYU Slavery Project. She's been both a RA and is now currently in the class that Dr. Jones and Dr. Mason are teaching. And she's also writing a really fantastic paper for my 498 class right now that looks at the Dixie successions in 1987 and 1988. So go ahead.
Our Father in heaven, we thank thee so much for our opportunity to gather as a university community, as fellow scholars and disciples of Christ. We thank thee for the preparation and scholarship of our panelists for their work in a variety of fields. We pray that thou wilt bless us with empathy, with insight, and with a sense of activity, that as we learn and as we discuss, that we may both reflect and prepare ourselves to truly lead out and to follow President Worthen's injunction, to follow President Nelson's injunction, and to follow our covenants as thy disciples, to build up the beloved community and to establish Zion. May we truly learn that and truly live that. And we pray in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. All right, I guess I get to get us started today. I read this book with great interest upon its publication, and I read it from kind of 3 different points of view or 3 different perspectives based on my own life experiences. I read it as a Texan, somebody who grew up and spent the majority of my life in suburban Dallas, as a historian, and in particular a historian of slavery in early America, and somebody who has read with great interest and learned from Dr. Gordon-Reed's scholarship for decades now. And more recently, I read it as a family historian. I am on the faculty of the family history program here at BYU. And so any book that includes any sort of family story immediately grabs my interest. And perhaps what resonated with me the most throughout the book was Dr. Gordon-Reed's central point that the story she tells, the story of her childhood, the story of her family's roots in Texas, and the broader history of African Americans in the United States and in Texas in particular, is American history. That the events she narrates and the individuals whose lives she describes, including she and her families, or her and her families, are not peripheral but central to the American story. I was struck by her comment on page 14 at the conclusion of her introduction that my wide-ranging approach to Juneteenth reveals that behind all the broad stereotypes about Texas is a story of Indians, settler colonialists, Hispanic culture in North America, slavery, race, and immigration. It is the American story told from this most American place.
Thanks. This is a very inclusive book, and there are many places in the book that talk about Native American history, which is my particular interest. I'm not from Texas, so I wasn't reading it through that lens. one of the things that she strives for is to create a many-layered, complex history, to recognize the complicated nature of the past. And she illustrates that in a number of ways in this book. For instance, she talks about the fact that you have white people displacing Native people in Texan history, but that if you go back a little further, you have Comanches, who are, of course, Native people, displacing earlier Native people. And she illustrates that with the idea that the word Texas itself comes from a Caddo word. This is an earlier Native group from Texas, the Tejas, or Texas word. She talks about the additional complexity of the fact that even among Native people, some of those members of the 5 civilized tribes who were driven into Indian country, Indian territory from the east, had enslaved people and had racist attitudes, that they're not all just one monolithic group. Another point that she raises that I found really valuable was the fact that she points out that for Black people as well as for Native people, they don't appear in the narrative, in the main narrative of Texas history. And that sometimes they might appear as, for instance, past antagonists in the case of, say, the Apache and the Comanche, but they are not the protagonists. They're not the cowboy hero kind of that plays the main role in Texas history. As I read the book, I kept looking for one particular theme that has become kind of important to me lately, and I was very happy to see that this theme did come up. And that is a theme that has been called by a couple of names. One is the twin tragedies of American history. Another is the foundational sins in American history. And that theme illustrates the way that Black and Native American histories are really intertwined in much of early America. Here's how she says it. Land taken from Native peoples in Texas was then cleared by enslaved people, who were then put to work planting, tending, and harvesting crops. So those twin tragedies are, of course, slavery and the dispossession of Native American land, which really work together in this period. The expansion of slavery comes at the cost of displacing Native people from their land, and then slavery itself is expanded because that rich land is able to yield so much wealth through the growing of cotton. I thought she did a really great job showing the way that those stories interweave and tell us a more complex story of American history.
So as I read this book, I kind of came into it with a different perspective. I was asked to join the panel, and I actually didn't know much about the way the book was written. I knew it was about Juneteenth, so as I started reading, and I actually listened to the book and then went back into it. But as I was listening, I kept finding myself asking the question, how does this relate to Juneteenth? And kind of looking inward at myself and realizing, at this point in my life, I'm reconciling with a lot of the different feelings I have towards the country. I love history. I love learning about the way people were before, the things that made them act a certain way and why they chose to do what they did. And as I was listening and learning from Professor Gordon-Reed, I just couldn't help but think, like where is she going? How is this gonna somehow bring it back to Juneteenth? And it made me think about the fact that oftentimes we look at a history as like, oh, if we think about France, that's France's history, or this is the U.S. history or Texas history. And I think the point she's trying to make is that this is everyone's history, that no matter where we are in the world, it's humanity's history, and we have to come to terms with that, because as we do that, we can better understand the complex nature of each individual. She says, speaking about the way that we perceive people in history, that a supreme risk with myths and legends or whatever kind is that we can easily fall in love with the people who are in them, as if we know them. People we actually know come to us with all sorts of good and bad characteristics that become apparent upon repeated contact. We weigh them, sometimes on a daily basis, and determine whether the good outweighs the bad, and we wish to continue with that person, or with the person. And she, further down on the page, then says, idealizing an individual one doesn't know personally usually involves taking the things one admires and making them embody the individual as a whole. But she consistently, in this book, drives home the idea that we don't actually know these people that we're studying, that we're learning about, and there are things about them that we may not like. And that doesn't change, their impact on history or how that's affecting us today, but we can reconcile with those ideas and come to terms with how that can help us be better. We can learn from anybody and everyone. And I think she does a great job of pointing that out through this book and her other books, that it's our job to work through it and be better tomorrow than we are today, and use what they taught us to do that.
So I did read this as a Texan. I'm actually like a Texan fanatic. So as a child, my house was on the corner of a street. And from that corner, I could see the old school that was used when schools were segregated. And that's the building that my community uses to host community celebrations. So every summer, I looked forward to Juneteenth because I got to watch the community come together to celebrate this beautiful holiday for their community. So that's what stood out to me as I was reading the book. And at the beginning of the book, Dr. Gordon-Reed states that she felt a sense of possessiveness towards the holiday as a Texan, and quickly realized that this holiday was something that can be shared and should be shared, because the spirit of the celebration is something that is a American experience. And I think that she did a really good job throughout her book demonstrating how interconnected every set of people were to one another, and how our actions affect how we experience the world. And I liked at the end, she kind of shared her own family traditions, how they celebrated the holiday, and it was combining African American cuisine with Hispanic cuisine. And I felt like that was a really good example of showing how cultures come together to create our shared communities. And especially with Juneteenth becoming a national holiday, I hope that we can recognize and feel comfortable engaging in this holiday, and maybe that looks different for everyone, but I hope that we feel that we can support and listen to the experiences of the African American community and grow together.
Thank you, Angelica. That is a vision for how it could be, how it should be. This panel is a model of inclusiveness. I've been welcomed on it, even though I have only very rarely been to Texas. So thank you for welcoming me on this committee, or this panel. I think that's the way commemoration can work. It can be inclusive. But one of the things that struck me in her chapter on, it's called On Juneteenth, within the larger book On Juneteenth, I think it's chapter 6, is how contested Juneteenth was very early on. African Americans were determined in Texas to celebrate Juneteenth, and they had to be determined because they faced violent and determined resistance amongst white Texans who were not interested in seeing them publicly celebrate the advent of freedom. And then all throughout the Reconstruction era, they had to show their determination. We are going to celebrate this holiday. And unfortunately, throughout most of American history, that's the way commemoration has worked. Many of us long for a time when we were unified as a nation and we could come together on July 4th. My own research into the politics of memory and the way we do commemoration in America shows how rare that has been. To actually pull off anything that is kind of unifying, because these things are inherently, from the very beginning of the celebration of July 4th, it was inherently political and contested. And that's because when we're doing commemoration, whether of a holiday or building a monument or all the kind of public commemoration we do, it's really less about history and more about what we value at the moment we're doing that commemoration. And so this is why it provokes conflict, is because Americans have been and remain, in case you have missed it, deeply divided over what we value right now. So contests over commemoration in all their varieties really tell us what the reason they get so personal and divisive is that they reflect what we value at the moment of commemoration. So it would be wonderful if Juneteenth becoming a national holiday and a new BYU recognized holiday would be a rallying point for the kind of inclusiveness that Angelica is talking about, but I don't think we should be surprised if the way we do commemoration remains deeply contested.
All right, so we'd like to invite you to come down to the front to ask questions, and maybe just as we wait for that, if there are any ways you want to respond to each other's comments, observations. I know I'm, go ahead. Okay, I know I'm especially thinking about Angelica's, I'm glad that she highlighted the possessiveness that Annette Gordon-Reed feels about Juneteenth and her kind of reluctance to let others into this celebration. And part of that is like fears of what it might become if this isn't just wholly owned by the African American community and by the African American community in Texas, originally. And it strikes me that this is really, a story that's relating and parallel, her feelings parallel what we see happening all around us and the possessiveness that we feel about American history, all the stories that we tell. And so I'm just, I'm reflecting on that, and I'm wondering if maybe the panelists can bring out, some of what, as Annette Gordon-Reed is struggling with this personally, she's also helping us to think about our nationalist-oriented histories, narratives, stories about America, and get us to maybe rethink those in a way that will allow us to be a little less possessive.
There we go. I'll address that a little. I thought one of the interesting aspects of the book was Annette Gordon-Reed talking about movies. Movies are very popular, fun to watch, and she describes an incident where they had learned that Disney had created a movie about the Alamo and that it was coming out, and she knew that there were at least a few at that time, Black people in the Alamo, and she says, would the Black character be good for Black people or bad for Black people? So she was worried about how this person was going to be portrayed. Would he be brave? Would he be chicken? Would he be, and I really identified with that because I think that as Latter-day Saints, we often have that fear when we hear that a book is coming out that's going to be a popular book about Latter-day Saints, or a movie that's going to portray Latter-day Saints. We always wonder, okay, are they going to get it right? Are they going to make us look stupid, or those identity questions loom kind of large. And she talked about movies portraying Native people as well, and how they would identify with those, for better or worse. And that sense of history, us wanting history to tell a story that matches our own sense of who we are, I think is really strong among people. And it's hard to get past that unless you find commonalities, things that you can share about who you are, whether that's being Texans or being Americans or any other category.
Can I add something? So in our planning meeting, Dr. Jones pointed out this quote at the end of the book, and I feel like this kind of answers how do we move away being possessive of our history. And the quote is, "Love does not require taking an uncritical stance towards the object of one's affection. In truth, it often requires the opposite. We can't be of real service to the hopes we have for places and people, ourselves included, without a clear-eyed assessment of their and our strengths and weaknesses." And I feel like as we come to understand that principle, that we become more okay with accepting parts of our history that perhaps don't reflect our best attributes. And having people know that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a good thing to look back and say, that wasn't okay, and that needs to change.
That's a great comment, and I'm going to tag on to that. Sorry for taking so much time. But one of my colleagues, Jake Rue, recently sent me a nugget from the news. A poll recently came out, and the question that was asked was, do you think that American history should be taught just focusing on the things that are positive and unique about America? Or should American history be taught acknowledging that both good and bad things have happened in American history? And I kind of expected that the outcome would reflect the split that we have in our country today, that it'd be like 50-50. Well, it was 80 to 20. 80% of Americans think that both the good and the bad should be told in American history, that we should learn from the things that we have done wrong in the past. And I thought that was really hopeful.
Yeah, if I can also tag on to Angelica's comment, I think it highlights, and Professor DeSwinitz, your question highlights the difference. Be careful about our terminology. If we are challenging the idea that, say, the Founding Fathers or Sam Houston or somebody were these larger-than-life, perfect figures, we're not really countering history. We're countering mythology. We're countering legend. And there's a real difference between legend and history, just like there's a difference between history and what I was talking about earlier, which is more like memory. When we are dealing with holidays or monuments or symbols, we're dealing with memory, and that is much more presently focused on present values. And history is also very different from legend and mythology. They often get mixed. I was similarly encouraged by that polling data and surprised by that polling data that more Americans than we might think have those terminologies straight, I think.
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the differences between history and myth, and as part of that, what history actually is, compared to what many people come into our classes thinking it is, and in the larger kind of public as well. So are there some things that really kind of come out from this book, or some good examples that help to make these distinctions?
Okay, I'll go. In the chapter titled People of the Past and Present, she has a really interesting discussion of how she wished and was long told that Native Americans and African Americans in Texas history had kind of natural loyalty to each other and kind of natural alliance, because they were both marginalized and oppressed by white Texans and white Americans. So it would seem like a natural alliance. And then it turns out that's not always true for reasons including what Professor Pulsiver was talking about earlier. And she makes this important point. There's a difference between recognizing points of connection between the past and present and wishful thinking about the past. Very often we encounter things in the past that are not what we expect, that complicate our understanding of what we think we expect. And historians are much more interested in understanding those things than kind of perpetuating wishful thinking about the past.
So a couple more kind of quotes from the book that I think go along with some of these themes that we've been talking about. Gordon-Reed says, the oppressor's version of historical events. So there's kind of often the assumption, and I think we see that with some of the discussions that are happening about what gets taught, for instance, in public schools today, that the oppressor's version of events, or that the traditional version of historical events, should naturally take precedence over the knowledge of the oppressed. And she really helps to kind of unpack some of our, she's addressing, very directly kind of the hesitancy that we have with discussing race in kind of deep in the founding of America. And she says, the obvious difficulty with those kinds of complaints is that people in the past talked a lot about and did a lot about race. It isn't some newly discovered fad topic. Race is right there in the documents, official and personal, and it would take a concerted effort not to consider and analyze this subject. And that, in fact, that evasion is exactly what happened, and that has created the history/actual myth that folks are having a hard time giving up. Any thoughts?
One of the things that I've been thinking about as it pertains to like the idea of this mythology that is created with our histories is, and I was looking for the quote, I just can't seem to find it, but we consider this history so long ago when it's actually a lot closer to us than we realize. And in the book, she refers to different members of her family that, she never got to meet them because they passed away, but they knew people who were enslaved. And I think we see that like with modern day history when we talk about the civil rights movement. A couple years ago, or I'm not 100% sure when, but they talked about how all the pictures have been changed to black and white to make it seem more distant, when a lot of them were in color originally. And I think, there's a lot of intention behind changing these things to where it seems more mythical, so that it doesn't seem like we can approach it. But if we realize how close they are, if we realize that Martin Luther King would only be at most 80, I haven't done the math, but he'd be in his late 70s probably. We realize that we have grandparents that age. We know people who went through the same experiences that he did, and we can start to demystify these experiences that we're reading about, because there's this huge disconnect when we read something and we're like, oh, that happened. But when we talk to somebody and we hear, oh, that's what you experienced, it changes it, because it's like, I know somebody who went through this. And that's something I really loved about how she went through in her book. You know, I wish I would have talked to these individuals about their experience. And you can see that she's made a more concerted effort to discuss people's individual histories. And that's something that can, one, help us to demystify these different topics, but also to actually connect and have a deeper understanding of these complex issues.
Yeah, I love that. She kind of shows over and over again kind of the value of making history personal, and that it always is personal. But then at the same time, she also recognizes that history, as she says, requires a degree of detachment, and that it's by, kind of divesting ourselves from particular stories that we're actually able to see those stories, right? Yeah, okay, so go ahead.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I really appreciate what you've said so far. I want to be a history teacher in middle school or high school, specifically American history. And so my question is, I agree that when I was a student, it really felt like this period of time was far away from me. And I grew up in rural Wyoming, and so it wasn't a huge issue there. But as a history teacher, what do you think that I can do, and what do you think the most essential points of coming from slavery to the Civil War to Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement, what do you think I can do to make sure the students know that it's not as far away as we think, and what do you think the essential points to know are for students in America?
I'm not going to do this just this one time, but I nominate Professor Jones to talk about our similar reaction when we learned that someone we know was the Ruby Bridges of her school.
Yeah, I've known Professor Gordon-Reed for a decade or so now. I don't know that it would be fair to characterize us as friends, but we're mutuals on Twitter, right? And so, we hang out occasionally at conferences. When I read the book and read that she was essentially the Ruby Bridges of Conroe, Texas, my mind was a little blown because Annette wasn't that old. She didn't seem old enough to have been a person that would desegregate a school. And it really kind of blew my mind a little bit. And maybe she's about 60 today, 62, I think. And maybe that seems really ancient to some of you in the audience today. As somebody rapidly approaching his 40th birthday, 60 no longer seems that old to me. And Annette in particular, somebody who writes about history, somebody who studies history, that she lived history, that she broke barriers in history, really kind of served to collapse the past in a way that was a little alarming to me initially when I read it. And I think this is the point that others have made, is much of this history isn't that far past, and even when it is, its legacies and its echoes remain with us today. I mentioned at the outset that I grew up in suburban Dallas, Texas, in a city called Plano. That when I moved there was about 30 or 40,000 people in 1990, and today is north of 400,000 people. And I moved from suburban Salt Lake City at the age of 6. And so I moved mid-first grade, went to school for the first day there in Plano. And the first thing that struck me was that unlike my school in Salt Lake, I suddenly had black classmates and Latino classmates and Asian American classmates. And I don't think I had any of those here in Utah. Maybe I did, but they were certainly a much smaller minority. And that was a very striking thing to me as a 6 or a 7-year-old, and those numbers mostly held true up through the time that I graduated high school. And I always sort of wore that as a badge of pride, that I grew up in a diverse city, that I had black friends, that I had Latino friends, that I was aware of what Juneteenth was. I didn't celebrate it growing up, but I knew that my black friends did each summer. And what I didn't fully appreciate, or appreciate maybe isn't the right word, what I didn't fully understand, I don't think as a child and as a teenager, was that although I grew up in or attended diverse schools, the community I grew up in was terribly segregated. When I moved to Texas in first grade, I started taking the bus each day, and my neighborhood was the furthest away from the elementary school, so the bus would come through and pick us up, and then we would pick up students, classmates in various neighborhoods the closer we got to school. And we would stop off in one neighborhood, and all of the Mexican kids would get on the school bus, and we'd stop off in the last neighborhood, and all of the black students got on the school bus. And that last bus stop was, we called it the Douglas stop. It was the Douglas community is what we knew it as. And it was where all of my black friends lived. And I didn't really think twice about that as a 7-year-old or as a 17-year-old. Those are things that didn't really resonate with me in any striking way. And it wasn't until I was a history major here at BYU that I decided to look into the history of the place where I grew up. And I learned some really interesting things. The Douglas community was one of the earliest neighborhoods in the city that later became Plano, Texas. It was founded in the 1860s by formerly enslaved individuals, newly freed individuals. It was named, as now seems abundantly clear to me, after Frederick Douglass, in honor of him, the noted abolitionist and orator. And I felt none of this was ever discussed in either like Professor Gordon-Reed, I took Texas history in both 4th and 7th grade. I don't remember any of this ever being discussed at all. And my understanding of Texas history was centered around kind of a whitewashed version of Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston and William Bowie and other kind of famous Davy Crockett, and then later space innovation and oil men. I kind of imbibed those same narratives that Professor Gordon-Reed details in her books. And I felt a sense of not just only sort of betrayal at what had been overlooked, especially in my local community's history, but also a real sense of loss, that I didn't fully appreciate the richness of the history of the place where I grew up. And I wonder if my African-American friends in elementary and middle and high school were aware of that history. It certainly wasn't taught to them in schools. Maybe like Professor Gordon-Reed, it was passed down through families and shared through those family stories, which is all a very kind of roundabout way of saying, I guess it may be two thoughts here. One, my professor, my colleague, DJ Gonzalez, whose office is next door to mine, I don't know if it's still out there, he used to have a sign outside his door that said something like, "History's big enough for everyone." And I think the idea here, right, is that history is the collective story of humanity, but we each make choices in the narratives that we craft, the individuals that we focus on, and what their stories tell us, what that history tells us. And I like that point, that history is big enough for everybody. And it's something I emphasize in my family history classes, that your family's history may not seem immediately striking or significant to you. My own family's history certainly doesn't seem that way a lot of the time. But they lived, like Professor Gordon-Reed's family, through significant changes, tumultuous periods in the American past. They experienced that, they embodied it. And I think when we come to sort of realize that and recognize that, it can make history both come alive, and it can also help us understand better just how not distant we are from the past, and that we're products of that past. We're a product of those historical forces and those decisions that individuals made along the way.
Thank you. That was really meaningful. I want to kind of build on a couple of those comments. The question was, how do we get our students to realize that this is not as far away as they might think it is? And I think what came out in what Professor Jones just said, and also in this book, is that the personal stories, when you get to know people in the past in the full complexity of their experience, that's what brings it closer. That's what makes us able to relate, to see the similarities as well as the differences between our own experience and theirs. And part of the challenge of telling these stories is what Professor Gordon-Reed calls the tyranny of ideas about the archive, or I'll just shorten it to the tyranny of the archive. The archive, the place where we store our history, is not a complete compendium of everything that ever happened. It reflects what people thought was important enough to put in a safe place for safekeeping, and that generally was people who were considered important at the time, who had property, who were literate. So often the stories of people who might not have been so well off in the past, or who didn't have the capacity to pass on things from one generation to the other because of economic oppression or circumstances, their stories don't make it into the archive. But those stories are still out there somewhere. How do we recover them? And there have been a lot of efforts in recent generations to try to recover some of those stories, either by interviewing people, oral histories, asking people about the experience of themselves or of their parents or their grandparents, finding ways to learn more about history through material culture. The book that just won the National Book Award for nonfiction was a book by Tia Miles that looks at a bag that was passed on from an enslaved ancestor down through history to her modern day descendants, which in the absence of recorded words still tells a story which she unpacks in this book. So there are ways to get at those stories, but we have to be willing to look beyond the traditional methods and the archive, the traditional archive, to other ways of finding these stories and making them personal for our students.
Can I just say amen to all of that? And you can also, I think, engage people, if they're at all like me, with some of your traditional figures if you approach them less as myth than as history. I love me some Abraham Lincoln. If we had ever had a boy, there was a real threat that he would become Abraham Lincoln Mason. Maybe why we have 3 girls cosmically. But I actually found Lincoln more interesting when I learned of him less as a figure on Mount Rushmore, literally carved in marble or whatever that rock is, and more as a fully appreciative, fleshed out human being who changed over time in his priorities, who did not identify himself as an abolitionist for most of his career. And so you can doing the kind of social history kind of work that Professor Pulsford is describing is one way to make the past feel more immediate. Another is to take some of these marble men off their pedestals and understand them as human. I think that actually makes the past more compelling rather than less. And sometimes makes you appreciate people you thought of as heroes as slightly more heroic because you can relate to them in different ways.
Yeah. So Annette Gordon-Reed says, this is the stuff of history, attempts to recognize and grapple with the humanity and thus the fallibility of people in the past and the present. And to this question about what do you want, what's something basic for young people growing up to understand about American history and about history in general, is a point that Annette Gordon-Reed makes kind of over and over again, and that's been kind of brought out here, is that the past is complicated, right? And people in the past are just as complicated as we are today. We think Annette Gordon-Reed says, we think our society is uniquely complicated today, but in fact, that's just not true. So, okay, Dr. Harris.
So as a quick anecdote about how close history is, my grandfather and his brothers were all musically talented, and they did what was called minstrel shows. So I'm pretty sure that means they performed in blackface in rural Utah, teens, 20s, 30s. Now, my grandfather and I are over 100 years apart, but that's not very far away, right? All of my grandparents were alive when Brigham Young was alive. So things are really much closer to us than just because our living memory is different. I have to think about my grandfather in blackface. I'm guessing in Hooper, Utah in the 1920s, no one had seen a black person, so it probably didn't even really occur to them. So my question is I've been really interested in the conversation, and I can think of several books in the last few years that have done this kind of work, taking traditionally marginalized group, whether that's race, gender, class, sometimes certain immigrant groups, and telling the American history story in a more, sort of decentralizing the kind of mythology of certain groups and showing how complicated all of that is. What I can't think of is somebody who took their family history, who's from the traditional dominant narrative, and tells a story that tells yet a different story, right? That shows how complicated that is. So I'm wondering, in this kind of audience, where we're all encouraged to write our family histories and read the histories on Family Tree, and my ancestors are Yankee, Norway, British, that's it. So they've been very much centralized in the American history story and the British history story. Even being Latter-day Saints, they're very much centralized in the Western American history story. So those stories I read on Family Tree, written in the first person by my ancestors, that are traditional sources that are great to have. I don't know anybody who's in the sort of traditional or the narrative we've inherited from high school textbooks, I guess, from years ago, who's re-examining their family from reading this kind of stuff and then going, okay, so my family had a more complex history. It isn't just heroic conquering this virgin territory kind of story and bestowing, civilization wherever we step. So for people who aren't going to publish a book like this, what are the things we can take from books like this to help just regular Latter-day Saints in their ward who want to write their family history and whose family, as far as they know, hasn't had to really confront these things in their lived experience to write a history that, one, benefits them as family, but also helps the collective group think about our past in more humane ways, right? Like you've all been discussing, that these are real fleshed out people. So.
Can I
Yes.
As you're actually speaking, I was really thinking about that, and I think that's a really, really interesting idea. And I think I'm biracial, just to put that out there, so this makes a little more sense. When I think about my mom's side, and she's white, there's a lot of stories I hear about and they're all really good. About my great-grandfather having his business with his brother, or this or that, and whatever. But I think something that oftentimes we overlook is that idea that when somebody's writing their personal history, a lot of times they're really sparse with the negative details, or the things that maybe don't look so great. And that's something I learned recently as my mom and my sister were asking more questions to her father, my grandfather, about his growing up in West Texas, and how his family, it's not the best thing to admit, but they were bootleggers and they prostituted their wives, which is an awful thing. I'm glad I didn't stay around that. But I think there's a lot more that we can dive into our families that allow us to be able to talk about these issues that, we have these traditions within our own families that came from somewhere. My grandfather's side of the family, they're really close because for a really long time they were all breaking the law, so they had to have each other's back. And so I just think there's a lot of traditions that a lot of times we don't know where they came from, but as we understand better the different dynamics within our families at that time in history, we can then write about that and learn from that complex history, because I think each family is unique, and recognizing the good and the bad allows us to understand how to apply that to ourselves, especially as a family history context.
So I would be the last person on earth, Amy, to suggest that there's some avenues of your own family history that you have yet to explore in terms of sort of illuminating this. Dr. Harris directs our family history program here at BYU, for those that don't know. But I will say this, I grew up and up until the last couple of years, envisioned my own family history in very similar terms to the way that you just described it. I have ancestors that came over on the Mayflower. I have other ancestors that immigrated to the United States after converting to the church in the 1840s and 1850s from Denmark and from the British Isles. It was a pretty traditional white American story. I could sort of, my own family history seemed to resonate with everything that I kind of learned about in American history high school classes. Students that I see some of you in the audience know that we occasionally use my great-grandfather, a man named Archie Lee Brown, as a case study in some of our family history, in some of my family history courses. This is the one line of my family, the Browns, that I didn't know much about. Dr. Pulsifer's laughing because she's also a Brown, and we put this connection together while presenting on another panel together a couple of years ago and realized that we were quite closely related. But Archie Lee Brown was a noted doctor, a noted physician, and I got interested in him because he spent time in Philadelphia, and he spent time in Virginia, and he spent time in London for his graduate and postgraduate studies. And my own graduate and postgraduate studies had taken me to Virginia and to London and to Philadelphia, and I thought, oh, like, this is my guy. Like, this is, this really resonates. And then I learned a couple of things. I learned that as a young medical student in the 19-teens, he was being trained in what was then the exciting new field of eugenics that would later fall out of favor after it was adopted by Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. That he published articles upon his return to Utah as a young physician promoting eugenics in the Young Women's Journal, in official church publications. And then a couple of years ago, I happened upon Archie Lee Brown's divorce record with my great-grandmother, and in really kind of explicit detail described his physical, mental, emotional abuse that he inflicted upon my great-grandmother as well as my grandmother and her siblings. And all of a sudden I thought, maybe this is not my guy. Maybe this is not the person that I want to hold close. And I don't know that I have any sort of really smart conclusions that I've drawn from this experience of researching his life, of coming to understand who he was and all of his complexity. But the story's only grown more complicated because I was on a panel with Dr. Pulsifer a couple of years ago at the Mormon History Association, and she was sharing some of the earliest research from her new project about her own ancestors, and she mentioned a Brown, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I realized that we were related, and the Brown she was describing was an ancestor of this Archie Lee Brown that I had spent some time studying. And then Dr. Pulsifer emailed me, I don't know when it was, time makes no sense anymore, over the last 2 years. It could have been 6 months ago or it could have been 3 years ago. I honestly don't know which it was. But she sent me an email and she said, and I hope I'm not scooping or, kind of, you don't want this out there yet, but she found a really fascinating court case from North Carolina in the 1820s, where our shared ancestor and his siblings were, if I remember the details correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, essentially petitioning to be ruled or identified as the rightful heirs in a probate case, and that they were denied that inheritance because they had African blood, because they had black blood, because they had an ancestor who was enslaved. And this added a whole new layer of complexity to my early 20th century ancestor, Archie Lee Brown, who was a eugenicist and who was quite explicitly racist in many things that he said. And I wondered, did he know that he had African ancestry? Did he know? Was he aware of this? Was he trying to compensate for this? And these are questions I don't have answers to. I'm still sort of gently feeling my way through this. And I learned pretty early on that when I called my father and said, hey, I learned this really fascinating new thing about your ancestor, he was a little less excited than I was by some of these discoveries. Which is all just a really complex way of saying history is complicated, and our own family histories are complicated, sometimes in ways that we don't anticipate, sometimes in ways that we don't expect. I don't have, like I said, brilliant insights about what to conclude here, but I do know that history's happened, and that coming to terms with who my ancestors are and the legacy that they left me means acknowledging and recognizing and studying and learning and trying to wrestle with the darker parts of that history in addition to kind of the better parts of that history, the more noble or inspiring parts of that history.
I just want to briefly add kind of an amen to that, and something that's helped me recently, very recently, as in this semester, to deal with that in my own family, and as we think about, say, our church's history or BYU's history. I long have known that I have Irish ancestry. I think that's why I like music in the minor key and love to talk about the English oppressors and so forth. And that, that's a heroic tale of where we're the good guys, the persecuted good guys. And I like that and long have identified with that. More recently found out that some of those Irish ancestors came well before the potato famine. And settled in South Carolina, and were later in Mississippi, and were big-time slaveholders who fought for the Confederacy. That was more disappointing than the kind of heroic tale of suffering good guys that I had long associated with. Something we read in our BYU Slavery Project class this semester. We've been engaging with a book that is dealing with how Georgetown has dealt with its complicated history and tragic history in connection with slavery, and something that one of the professors at Georgetown had learned from a German friend who argued, as a German, it would be totally unfair for me to claim Bach and Brahms, but not Birkenau and Auschwitz. You got to claim it all if you're going to claim your history, and deal with claiming it's selective to either claim only Auschwitz or only Bach. And it would be selective for me to either only reject my ancestors as wrong for having fought with the Confederacy or awesome for having experienced English oppression. You got to claim it all, I think, and that's hard, but I think it's necessary.
So I think I'll add to that too is as Annette Gordon-Reed kind of helps us to see the kinds of questions that historians ask. She's getting us to think about like this story about the Yellow Rose of Texas. What work is this doing, and how did this story get constructed over time? And to think about, she really gets us to think about how origin stories matter both for nations and for individuals, and that they really form our sense of self. They tell us what kind of people, she says, we believe we are, what kind of nation we believe we are, and that's true for family stories as well. And so I know I've had opportunity, in part, there's a really great book, and then there was a documentary made, Slavery by Another Name, that explores the kind of rise of the convict lease system after emancipation, and kind of what that meant and did to people of color in this country. And in that film, the filmmakers have some of the descendants of the people who illegally held and brought into the convict lease system African Americans in the early 20th century. And and kind of uncovering this history totally went up against their family lore. And I think that we all have kind of family mythology, family stories that fit in with the kind of, especially within the United States, within these kind of larger American myths that we tell ourselves. And so as I think about like my own family stories and when and how my family in the past went from the working class to the middle class, putting that history into the larger context of what's happening in America, it looks really different, right? So if I think about my grandfather using, a VA loan to buy a house in Provo in a red line district, right? Or my father serving a mission to the southern states at a time when African American men couldn't have the priesthood and couldn't serve missions. And this is what gave my dad these leadership opportunities and kind of set him on the path that my family was able to benefit through. So I think that this book has a lot of, and partly just presenting, like, this is what my story looks like, Annette Gordon-Reed's story, where she's a 6-year-old, but she's a controversial figure, and kind of reimagining our own histories within the larger context of American history, I think, can be really powerful, especially as we think about how we create Zion and a place of true belonging that recognizes all these stories. All right, Bree.
Yes, hello. My name is Brianna Bratzman. So you've touched on this a little bit already, but I think one of the main themes throughout this book is the need for criticism from people in the community and from people who love what they are criticizing, right? That the true love of something has to come with criticism. And in that light, what is our responsibility as members of the church to grapple with our own church history that is spotted and pretty complicated, especially our relationship with whiteness, as like Paul Reeve has discussed, and stuff like that.
It's a really good question and a heavy one. So, I just finished writing a biography for Paul Reeve's website called A Century of Black Mormons. And the goal of this website is to provide short biographies of every Black member of the church who was baptized in the first 100 years of the church's history. And the biography I wrote was for a woman called Nancy Smith. And the reason that I knew about her and brought her to Paul's attention and said, let's look at her experience, and I agreed to write the biography, is because she was enslaved by my fourth great-grandfather, who came to Utah from Mississippi. And group that's sometimes known as the Mississippi Mormons. They joined the church and then came west, many of them under the guidance of Captain James Brown, our mutual ancestor. And many of them brought enslaved people with them. And that's kind of, it's a painful and uncomfortable history. As you know from hearing what Dr. Jones had to say, I also have we have African ancestry. I have Native American ancestry. My dad recently sent an email and said, hey, we just discovered a new branch of our family history in England, and it turns out that they were smugglers and they were a crime family, so like yours. So we have all of these threads of our history. Some of them are very painful, and we sometimes feel a little ashamed of them. Others we think, oh wow, that's really cool. I think that we have to, as Professor Mason said, own all of them. Be willing to be upfront about the painful and and ugly parts of our history and the repercussions that they still have in the present. At the same time as we celebrate some of the happier parts of our history, but we need to embrace them all. And I think it's worth remembering that even these ancestors whose activities or relationships with others that make me really uncomfortable, they, like the rest of my ancestors, are children of God. And just erasing them from the picture is not acceptable. We have to acknowledge their faults and then also acknowledge the fact that they are part of the human race. They are part of God's children, and we have to hold open the possibility, if not in this life, maybe in the next, that they can repent and correct the errors that they have. So it's not, we don't just end the story here. I mean, that's the way that I've kind of had to reconcile the many conflicting threads of my family history, which cover such a range of different experiences, is that I own it all.
Something that stood out to me in Dr. Gordon-Reed's book was her story with the store owner who was white. And I think that at the end of that page, it talks about how whiteness, she felt like maybe he was protecting his whiteness because he knew that it empowered him and gave him certain privileges that she didn't have. And I feel like it's really important to recognize that uplifting other people doesn't take away from yourself. And that's always a good thing to do.
Okay. Oh,
Can I go real quick?
Yeah.
Thanks. I think just to add on to what's been said, I think one, that was a really great question, and I think I want to applaud you for being vulnerable, because that's a hard question to ask in public. And I think something that I remember my dad telling me, so there's something in the church called the Genesis group, and my dad, when he was still in Texas, helped create the branch in the Dallas area. And Darius Gray told him, or was sharing a story about when he joined the church, and basically he joined the church because of his testimony of God and that relationship. And I think a lot of times it's easy to get caught up. There is a lot of emotion and pain and hurt within our own histories, but especially within the history of the church. It's not fair, right? And we have to just recognize that. And no, I'm not saying that we shouldn't recognize it. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, but I'm saying that we also have to put our relationship with God first. Sometimes God asks us to do things that are hard, that don't make sense. Darius Gray joined the church when he couldn't have the priesthood. And I think, there are things that we won't understand, like Dr. Pulsifer said. And as it pertains to the history of the church, we can dig into it, try and understand everything we can, but also realize that, we have to act on faith. And some of the questions that we have will not be answered. And that's kind of how it goes, and it sucks. And I'll be the first one to tell you it sucks, and I don't like it. But as we do that, our relationship with God continues to be strengthened, and we are able to better act in the ways that he would want us, to be inclusive, to lift others, and recognize that it's not going to hurt us, like Angelica was saying. And so I just wanted to add that, because I think oftentimes we do get distracted, and it's easy, because as soon as we're hurt, there's everything else coming at us at the same time. And so.
Thanks. We're coming up on official closing time, but we've got two more folks who have questions. So I think we'll go ahead and do that, and then.
Okay, this is really quick, and this might seem like kind of a silly question, but I think with so many different aspects of why Juneteenth became a holiday, what do you think that the overarching purpose of it is? Why do you think that we needed Juneteenth as a holiday?
I think something that Professor Mason said earlier, we commemorate and we set things apart to designate the value that it has to us today. And I think as a country, we're trying, and there's a lot of stuff that we can do better, but like we're trying to reconcile with our past. And we're trying to put value in recognizing the different parts of our country which haven't been recognized before. And I think by doing this, it's showing that we care. Like this is something that's important to us, and we're putting value into this. And hopefully those who come after us put value into this as well.
First, thank you all for such a great panel. Let me try to articulate this question concisely. Something that's I think is very fascinating about Gordon-Reed's book is how she is trying to make this an American story, right? This is something for all of us. I want to ask, do any of you see any ways in which we should or could be cautious, any reason for caution in this? If we take this big American story that has historically and traditionally been focused on a very small segment of the population and start grafting on other stories to it, where do we draw the line between we're including people versus colonizing their stories to say, you embody the Jefferson vision of the Constitution or something like that? At what point are we naming a wing of Monticello after Sally Hemings, which is sort of insulting and not really honoring? How do we avoid those sort of pitfalls? Thank you.
That's a great question. I don't know that my answer will be satisfactory to you, Makoto, but I think part of it is by not falling back into the easy trap of simplistic myths. So to tie your question together with Sierra's question asked just before, Juneteenth presents a really fantastic opportunity to commemorate and celebrate the end of slavery, as I think it rightfully should. But as Gordon-Reed introduces in the opening of her book, this holiday is actually celebrating when enslaved individuals in Texas found out about the fact that they had actually been freed 2 years earlier, and then nobody's actually guaranteed their freedom until we have the amendments to the Constitution months later that sort of cement this. And then we have asterisks attached to that with what Dr. DeSchweinitz talked about regarding sort of convict leasing and convict labor in the years following the Civil War and its aftermath. And so I think of holidays as a chance to celebrate, to commemorate, to take a day off, to relax, but also a day to reflect on American history and all of its complexity. We're celebrating Thanksgiving next week. That's a very comparable holiday in some sense in terms of the myths that have been brought up, grown up around that, and the much more complicated history underlying those myths. And whether my kids like it or not, they're going to get some education next Thursday at that dinner table, right? As are my in-laws. And I don't mean that sort of condescendingly, let me pontificate for you, right? But I want holidays to be a chance to reflect on the good and to celebrate the good, but also to reflect on the more complicated, nuanced understanding of this. I think of the 4th of July as a similar opportunity, right? And so what I hope is that Juneteenth becomes not just a way to pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, good, we ended slavery, right? But a chance to reflect on all of the ambiguities of what the end of slavery meant and the legacies of slavery and emancipation that remain with us today.
All right. Thank you to our panelists and to everyone who posed questions. I'm really glad that Angelica kind of brought up toward the end here this story that Gordon-Reed raises about the white store owner who feels that there's something to lose, right, as society changes. And I think that, like Bree's question, like there's some sense and reluctance to embrace and really look hard at the past at BYU, in the church, in our own family stories, in our nation's stories. But that kind of the overall, what Gordon-Reed's book really shows is the beauty that comes, the richness that comes from a more inclusive understanding of the origins of the United States and of our shared history, and that telling stories that require us to kind of go back and rethink and be more inclusive are stories that are going to reflect the eternal truth that all are alike unto God, and that will help us to build the kind of Zion community that our Heavenly Parents want us to. Thanks for participating.